Without further ado, I'd like to call forward the Chief of Staff of the Defence Forces, Vice Admiral Mark Millet, to give the keynote address. Welcome, Mark. Thank you.
Minister Stanton, Deputy Mayor, deputies, elected representatives, members of the committee, members of the ONE, members of the Naval Association, Flag Officer Commanding Naval Service Michael Malone, members of the Bransfield family. It's a great pleasure to be here to actually say a few words about Edward Bransfield. I think he's been an extraordinary character, and when we look at the history and his achievements, it's quite as outstanding that he is not up there in the icons of other great mariners of this state. And I think today we're doing some justice in terms of correcting that. He was born near here in 1785, and while we know he was a Catholic, we're not too sure where he was educated. May have been a head school, but he certainly was well educated. And it's important to have a sense of that time, a sense when perhaps what we talk about today in terms of diversity and inclusion wasn't very current, and in fact the slave trade was in full swing, with over 12 million slaves have been shipped around up to that point in time. The Royal Navy was the primary sea power in this world, and it's interesting that when Edward was 8 years of age, that France went to war with Great Britain, and it continued in war up to 1815 when Napoleon met his Waterloo. From Edward's point of view, it's of interest also because when he was about 18 years of age, he was out with his father fishing, and he was pressed into service by the Royal Navy. This is a technique that Mick Malone is considering for the Irish Navy. And it's also of interest that actually Admiral William Brown was pressed into service by the Royal Navy. But Edward gave extraordinary service with the Royal Navy, and he's actually mentioned in dispatches. And back in 2005, I had the privilege of representing the Irish state in the bicentenary of the Battle of Trafalgar. And I remember a well-known RTE commentator making a point of what was Ireland doing saluting Her Royal Highness, the Queen of Great Britain at that particular time. But the simple reality is that over 4,000 Irish men fought in the Battle of Trafalgar. And in all probability, one of those men was Edward Bransfield, who at that stage was in service for 2 years with the Royal Navy. He was also mentioned in dispatches with regards to the release of over 3,000 slaves in Algiers off the Barbary coast in 1816. And the whole issue of slavery at that time was not just in terms of Africa towards the US. It was also a matter of, if you recall, the sack of Baltimore back 200 years earlier, and a very large white slave trade happening in the area of Algiers by the Corsairs. In 1817, Edward went to Valparaiso, where he actually was the navigator on the vessel Automache, which was a former French vessel. And while he was there under Captain William Sheriff, another merchant seaman who was navigating around bringing tobacco and cloth and medicine, trading around Cape Horn, actually looking for a good wind, travelled further south and noticed some land that was subsequently identified as the South Shetland Islands. And he reported that to Captain Sheriff in Valparaiso, and eventually Captain Sheriff sent Edward Bransfield on the merchant vessel Williams as master to go and investigate it further. So Edward Bransfield with William Smith as his navigator headed south towards the South Shetland Islands, and they went on further across the Weddell Sea and eventually saw what is now known as Trinity Peninsula. And I think it's very appropriate that Trinity Peninsula should be here beside the name of Tom Crean and this wonderful monument that is in his honour. Edward Bransfield reported back and also named the island there George Island, which is just after King George, who had died a couple of days beforehand. And on board his vessel was a young midshipman called Charles Pointer, who recorded in his diary on that date immense mountains and rude crags, barren ridges with snow, clearly noting the presence of actual land in that description. The continent, in terms of who found it, has been in dispute because Fabian Ballinacurra, a Russian admiral, was also given credit for finding the Antarctic a couple of days beforehand. But in his description, Fabian Bellinghausen has never mentioned any land other just to reference white sheets of snow. So I think there is a question to be pursued in terms of a peer review of the documents that appear at that time, and in particular the record of Charles Poynter, the midshipman, whose contemporaneous note on the 30th of January in 1820 at 3 p.m. in the afternoon makes that clear description of land being sighted by Edward Bransfield, and that is the contemporaneous record of fact. I want to commend the organising committee here for an extraordinary event. I want to remember Edward Bransfield and what he represented. He obviously clearly was a humble man, because every mariner is a humble man, having absolute respect for the sea. He was a man of principle, and I think the same principles that apply today in our own defence force of moral courage and physical courage and respect and integrity and loyalty and selflessness define Edward Bransfield. And if I would make one final point, at the very time that Edward Bransfield was discovering the Antarctic with his base from Valparaiso in Chile, over the Andes and the other side of that great continent, Admiral William Brown was found in the Argentine state, another great Irish mariner. So today I think we're correcting history. We're putting Edward Bransfield, his achievements, his legacy on a pedestal where they should justly stand. And I would ask, perhaps there is an opportunity for a peer review of the actual record from Charles Poynter's log of that time and the records from Fabian Bellinghausen, the Russian Admiral, who also contests finding Antarctic. It's a privilege to be here, and thanks very much for the opportunity to be here. I do feel a slight imposter because I think this is a privilege that should be to your Minister and your Mayor. But thank you very much. You wrote to me 2.5 years ago. I don't normally get that notice, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.